Here then, we're going to take a look at the car paint shader, and for this exercise we are going to roll out the Jag. So, car paint is, obviously enough, given by its name, a shader, a material that is really designed for the use of car paint, like surfaces. That is, however, not the only thing it's good for. It is one of the most prominent uses of the material. But there are indeed one or two other places where it can be quite useful, and we'll have a peek at some possibility there shortly. So here we see what we just get by default with the shader, and straight away, you know, it's pretty awesome. It's a lovely metallic painted look. You might, in many circumstances, just be happy with this. Throw on car paint, give it some sort of shade or different colour, such as perhaps a classic Jag green, and there we go. The job is, as they say, a good 'un. But in spite of this, let's take a look at the parameters to see what we've got. First of all, I'm going to turn these guys just down to nothing here, so we can start by looking at bits and pieces in isolation. And the first thing that we have is the paint itself. Car paint, of course, is commonly, not always, but commonly, a layer of paint which is lacquered over the top. As such, it will have multiple levels of specularity. The first, of course, being the paint at the bottom, beneath the clear coat. Now we do see, if we take a look just with a plain backdrop here, that the paint does, of course, have an incidence-based response. However, what we notice is that this is the opposite of a normal Fresnel. Here it's going darker at the grazing angle, and of course the specular is brighter at the facing angle. This may seem wrong, but of course car paint is designed to have a clear coat over the top. At least the shader is designed to have a clear coat over the top. That, which of course we have here, the clear coat specularity, and we can see that in isolation in the clear coat buffer here, that does have a normal specular response. A normal Fresnel response with a bright limb, as we see coming here on the grazing angles at the front of the bonnet, or the hood if you prefer. As such, this is all energy conserving, of course. As the clear coat is getting brighter at the limb, then of course the paint specular is getting dimmer at the limb, since light has to penetrate the clear coat to reach the paint. You can also see, of course, that as I'm adjusting the clear coat specularity up and down, the paint specularity is getting brighter or darker. So we don't need to worry about, dealing with Fresnel or anything ourselves with this shader. It is all built in for us. It is properly physical and PBR. That aside, whilst we're looking at the paint specular here, we'll notice that we of course have the different options for it, such as of course, the good old classic roughness. Normally the paint itself will not be highly reflective and specular. It won't be very glossy, but in some paint jobs it may be. You might have a very high gloss paint with a clear coat lacquer over the top. Perfectly possible, and one way to get a really shiny looking paint job in your car paint. Of course, by having a different roughness value in your paint specular, it enables you to get a really nice layered specularity in the shader, giving much more rich and complex reflections and highlights. We also notice that paint has its own bump height here. That's because if we look in the nodes, we'll see that actually we have multiple bump and normal inputs on this shader. We have bump and normal for the paint, as well as bump and normal for the clear coat. So not only can you get layered specularity, you can actually get layered rippling effects as well. It's not just a single bump. For instance, if you go out and look at a regular car on the street, just an average everyday Ford or something, and you look nice and closely, you will see that the reflections of the paintwork do have a bit of a rippling effect to them. Generally, the paint is just a standard, quick spray job, and the lacquer as well, just a, good basic coat of clear coat. Well applied, but not necessarily hugely precisely applied, and thus you get this little rippling where the surface is mildly uneven. And of course, the amount of unevenness will be slightly different between that of the paint layer and the clear coat layer. If you go and look at a much more expensive car, like a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, then whilst the paint and the clear coat aren't qualitatively different, the quality of the paint job itself is, and you will find that they are a lot smoother. There is far less rippling in those paint jobs. So having the multiple bumps like this allows us to create those kind of subtle effects. Next, we have this parameter, iridescence. Now at present, this won't seem to show an awful lot. It just appears to make our paint here get darker. This will be more obvious if we switch to a light tone so that we can see this more clearly. So if we switch to a light grey, suddenly we see colour. Iridescence is this property that basically changes the colour depending on your angle of view. It's the sort of thing that you see in mother of pearl or in an oil spill. You have a refraction that causes light to split, like under a prism, and what we'll see is if we start tweaking some of the wavelength values here, which represent the red, green and blue. For instance, let's turn the red down and the blue up, and here we see that on the facing angles we're getting this pinky colour, this redder colour, whilst on the grazing angles we're getting this blue colour. As we change the thickness value of the iridescence, then we start to see it begin to shift through the hues. Generally what you will have to get the two-tone of the iridescence is you'll have two of the colour bands higher and one of them lower. And then as you push through the thickness values, which of those colours becomes more prominent will alter, as we see here. Because of the way this works, this does rely on having a bright base colour. And of course, the iridescence is also tied to the specularity, and so you will see it become more apparent in reflections like this as the paint roughness value goes down, or as the paint specular becomes more glossy. It is indeed a very sensitive effect, the iridescence, and does usually take a bit of tweaking to get right, as it responds to, of course, the roughness of the paint specular, the thickness, the wavelengths of the colours, and also, as we see here, the refraction index of the paint that is used. It's through balancing all of these together that you get the different iridescent looks. You can get very rich, very complex paintwork, but it will take a little bit of play to get it just so. Next then, of course, we have the clear coat, which is indeed, as the name suggests, just this coat of clear lacquer that sits over the top of the main paintwork. Very little to be said of that, of course. It simply has a specularity value, which is of course properly reciprocal with the paint specular value, such that you get something that is properly energy conserved. You don't have to add up both of these values to equal 100. The shader will take care of all of that for you. And it likewise has, of course, its own roughness setting. This is the only place where you sort of can go wrong with the shader and sort of break the photorealism of it and the, PBR nature of it, and that is to have a very rough clear coat with a shinier or glossier paint. Of course, in reality, this would be impossible, because if the clear coat on top is rough, then any light going through it and bouncing off of the paint would be scattered and roughened coming back out of the clear coat again. That said, you can create some interesting looks by having it this way, but generally you always want your clear coat to be as glossy or glossier than the paint beneath it. Lastly then, we have flakes. These are for simulating metallic style paints. By default, these are quite small and realistically sized for realistic proportion, but let's just turn them up a bit here. And here we go. We begin to see them at this stage quite prominently. We get these flakes, little flake shapes appearing. And notice, of course, that they come up mainly in our specular highlight. As we roll away from where the specular hits are, then the flakes start to just bleed out into obscurity. The settings for them here are pretty straightforward. The height is how, prominent they are. Basically just a strength setting for how visible the flakes indeed are. The density parameter is simply how densely packed they are. Lower values give us far fewer flakes, just the occasional little one here and there. The distance fall off is how far away we are from the surface before they just fade away. So you see here I've got it set to 100 meters, which means you can see them from a great distance. But as this comes down to very low values, you notice that the flakes disappear. This is principally because, of course, they use resources to render, and as you get further away from the vehicle, they will be less and less noticeable. And of course, when you are some distance away, each flake will be tiny, and their little variation of light and dark can easily present as noise. The scale then is simply how big the flakes are, and here of course I've radically overdone it. Ordinarily something much closer to the default setting of around 1 millimeter or 1.5 millimeters or whatnot is going to be much more realistic, and you see it gives you this slightly metallic highlight, this mottled dotty highlight. Just here actually at this scale it even starts to look a little bit like reflection noise, but it's not. It is indeed these little micro flecks of metallic paint giving us these just, varied spot speculars. Generally you would tend to use these not for smooth coloured paint, but of course for that metallic paint that has all of the little sparklies. And often that would be accompanied by having a much higher paint specular value. When you have that, you can see that that is when the metallicness of the flakes really starts to sing through. And of course, once we get the clear coat on top of that, it becomes even more obvious the effect that these flakes are having on the paint specular and the little metallic hits that they give us in the bright spots, the reflections and the highlights. So there we go. We have ourselves a attractive, highly versatile and very realistic car paint shader available to us with just a few clicks. No excuses for fake looking car bodywork in our renders anymore. Of course, I did say that the shader is good for not just car paint, but a variety of different types of surface. And the principal reason for that is its clear coat layer. Whilst there are other clear coat options in other materials, the wonderful thing about car paint is that it's fully set up for us with reciprocal specular, both of the underlying paintwork and the clear coat on top, with of course the two-way Fresnel effect for the proper energy conservation there. So it makes it quicker and easier to get these high quality photorealistic clear coat effects. And that can be highly useful if we want to do things such as perhaps lacquered coated plastics or ceramics, coffee mugs, dinner plates and so on. They can work very well with car paint, as indeed can other types of surface such as heavily varnished woods, as you might find in some furnitures, or indeed highly polished floors. And so there we have it. That is the car paint shader, its various settings and options, and of course surfacing possibilities.